I was wondering if you could address regionalistic aspects of the art that you've seen. For example, you spent time in the upper Midwest. You're currently in,
Texas.
I guess it's a cross between the lower Midwest and the Southwest, the Texas area.
Yeah.
And your earlier experience was on the East Coast, and you had experience with the Nuyorican poetry movement of the late 20th century, as well as being involved in the late half of the 20th century with Stone Arts Bridge and the Twin Cities area. And I was wondering if you could address similarities and differences with these groups as also compared to what you're seeing in the early part of the 21st century in the Texas area.
Well, as far as Texas, I haven't really gotten involved in the arts area. I was involved and going into readings, and I've probably been to about 2,500 readings and arts events over the years. Probably in my 12 years in Texas, I mean, I'll go around to sometimes some of these small Texas towns to visit art galleries and see when they have art fairs. But I haven't done any like readings or anything in the Texas area. In the 1980s, when I first started getting into the arts, I would go out sometimes after work on a Saturday or a Friday night, and I would go to some of the warehouse districts where they would have what you call, I guess, day class, say, Warholian type things, where that there's the gal Karen something or other who would drown herself in chocolate, and she'd do her spoken word. I can't remember her name, Karen. Oh, I can't remember her last name, but she infamously was censored by Jesse Helms back in the 90s. Karen Finley, that's her name. And so I remember seeing her. The Nuyorican, when I was going there for about 5 or 6 years, the Nuyorican Cafe was they were going all around the boroughs and places because the cafe had been burned down, I think, and I didn't have much use for those people. I actually did an obituary about Maggie Estep, who was probably one of the most well-known of the Nuyorican people. I'd known her for about 5 or 6 years in the late 80s, and I actually did a new feature called Ask Dan Schneider, where I'd, over the last year, gotten some nasty emails from people about why I wasn't more positive in my obituary. And that's because she's a person who didn't live up to what she could have been. I think she was exploited and used, and she ended up, dying young, probably from years of drug abuse and whatnot. But the Twin Cities was probably the area I was the most active in, and that was from 91 to 03. I ran a poetry group, the Uptown Poetry Group, for 8 years. It met twice a month for 8 years. I went to a lot of cabarets and performed poetry. I told you I had this Twin Cities list of artists. That there was a kind of satisfaction there. But in all of these areas, whether it's online now, whether it's in the Twin Cities in the 90s or New York of the 80s, there's always a large degree of poseurs, people who just like to get up and pretend that they're artists. They want to get up and, my boss is an asshole, and they'll spout on for 5 minutes as if it's a poem, or they'll urinate into some paint and then shit into some other paint, and they'll blob something on a silk screen or something, and that's art, even though it's just shit and piss, and it doesn't say anything of any depth. And so you always have those kinds of poseurs. That I have the most. Every so often you'll meet someone. There were a few people, a few poets I met that had really great talent that I've always remembered, and I've tried to keep in touch with. There are some people who were into films and whatnot that I've tried to keep in touch with. But what happens most of the time is young people have this sort of creative yearning that it's this: I have to say something. I have ideas. I need to speak on something. But just because you need to speak on something doesn't mean that people are going to be interested in hearing what you have to say. And you have to get out of this solipsistic nature that most people uh, and most artists fall into. No one gives a damn about Dan Schneider if he had a bad day at work. No one gives a damn about Dan Schneider or Wallace Stevens if he came home and he had to call a plumber. No one cares about these things. The things that people care about are the things that you can bring to the table that get people to understand existence. Artists are translators of reality. Uh, why, how do we deal with the loss of a loved one? My mother died. How do I deal with that? My girlfriend left me. How do I deal with that? I lost my job. How do I deal with that? I feel lonely. I don't know why. I look up into the sky and see all the stars out there, and I feel so small. How do I combat that? Well, a great piece of art makes you think that. I had a recent downturn here in the last couple of weeks. It was not something of my own fault, but a few days ago I watched The Thin Red Line, the Terrence Malick film from 1998, and then
Mm-hmm.
the next day I watched a documentary on the Japanese filmmaker Yasujiro Ozu. Uh, this documentary, Ozu is probably one of my favorite filmmakers. He's a great filmmaker, but he's a personal favorite because he has, I don't know if you've ever seen his films. He doesn't take himself too seriously, but yet his films are all focused upon the small moments of life and on the interactions between people. And after I watched that, I got a call from someone that gave me some good news, some hopeful news for maybe an upturn in my life. And in my mind, of course, I say, maybe that was Ozu reaching out from the grave. That was a sign. Now, I don't believe in such things, but when you're in your most down moments, you sort of grasp at those kinds of things. But um, it's those are the things that art is the most essential about art, and those are the people that I carry the most with me. Yes, I remember people who aren't creative. I remember little things. I always talk about all of the people that I've known in my life, and even the bad people who, if they dropped dead, I wouldn't really care about. They are in my life, and that's better than nothing because of all the people who have ever existed. That's just uh, an almost infinitesimal fraction of all the people that could have existed. And these people, even if you're dealing with someone who's a psychopath, a bad boss, even if you're dealing with someone who's a murderer or a rapist or a child abuser or a crooked politician, at some point they have an one of the nostra of political correctness is that everyone has a story, and that's true. Most stories are dull. Most stories are repetitive. Just as most marriages, are not going to have real deep love. Most people are just together so that they aren't lonely. I've known many people, many friends who've broken up and whatnot, and they tell me afterwards, I never really loved him, or I never really loved her. I just was lonely, and I don't know how. I myself don't know how to operate in that sphere. I can understand things intellectually, but sometimes emotionally, when people tell me things, I'm like, I just don't emotionally get that. I would never put myself in that position. But art can get you beyond that. Art can make me forget that I'm Dan Schneider and I've had a bad week or a bad month or whatnot, and I can look at a thin red line and and yes, they are actors, and I know intellectually they are actors, but I can be drawn in past my knowledge of that, and I can be emotionally drawn in uh, by the greatness of the art, not because it's simplistic, but because of the very nature of its great construction, and it draws me in, and I can see something terrible happen to someone there, and not only that, when I rewatch something, I can remember thoughts that I had at a particular scene when I first saw that movie 17 years ago and say, "Oh, I remember sitting in a theater and the first time I saw that scene, and I remember what I was thinking." I can look at an old poem of mine from 20 years ago, and I can look at a line and say, "I remember what I was doing, where I was, what I was thinking when I wrote that line." And in the same way, I can do that if I see a passage from Moby Dick or from an Oscar Wilde play. And those are the things that make art essential. The very reason that art is so great is that art is not necessary. It is the cherry on top. It is the thing. Yes, we need food, we need clothing, we need shelter, we need this, that, and the other thing. Those are real physical needs. But it's the art that makes it worthwhile because otherwise we're just biological shit machines, as Allen Ginsberg infamously said in one of his poems, shit machine, shit machine. What makes us different than an aardvark? What makes us different than a butterfly? What makes us different than just these animals that are fated to live their lives? But just before we got together here online, I was watching a clip of an old documentary that I had seen about lions and hyenas, eternal enemies, and how the lions and hyenas don't have the ability to control their fate. The hyenas can't say, I don't want to be an asshole and antagonize a beast 3 times my size that can kill me. The lion doesn't have the ability to say, I just going to ignore these little shit hyenas. But they antagonize each other and they go at each other. We as humans have the ability not to do that. We as humans have the ability to create art, not all of us, of course, only a few of us, and only a few of that have the ability to make something that transcends and can go beyond. But that's important, and that's something that's even missing in the art scene. Too many, to get back to the original point, too many people in the art scenes are all about themselves. The greatest art is selfless. And the best example that I can give of this is, I'll give you Rainer Maria Rilke. I think of published poets that you could know of. I think Rilke probably has the most great published poems of any poet. He's also the only poet that I know of that wrote great poems in 2 languages, most of them in German, a handful in French. But Rilke himself was an asshole. I mean, if you look at his biography, he was probably misogynistic. He was a liar, a cheat. He was a terrible father. He was selfish. He put people down. He had no consideration for anyone. Yes, he wasn't Jeffrey Dahmer, but he was pretty much an asshole. Yet he transcends that in his greatest poems. There's that ineffable spiritual quality that he himself couldn't reach, but somewhere underneath that reptilian exterior, that asshole exterior of Rainer Maria Rilke, there was some good that came through, like these little sunbursts coming through clouds that had that moment. And he'd write the Duino elegies, he'd write the new poems, and somewhere that came through, and that's an amazing thing. And you can have a lot of great people who are great individuals who are loving and caring, and they can't do that. And that's not to say that their lives are meaningless, but they will never be able to affect anyone past the propinquity of their existence. They are never going to be able to affect someone in China. They are never going to be able to affect someone in 2132 the way Rilke can. And that specialness needs to be acknowledged. That specialness needs to be upheld. It needs to be rewarded. And people need to say, God damn, that's a good thing. It's a good thing that people make art. And too many people are not like that. They're just selfish, and the selfishness, the inability to get beyond their own limited means is something that damns a lot of people, both personally and artistically. And that's been my major experience of the last 30 years. And this is why a lot of people outside the arts are always complaining about how selfish artists is. And it's true. Most of them are selfish, but the greatest artists can get beyond that. I could sit here and bitch and moan about all the things that have gone wrong in my life currently or in the past, but I've lived long enough to know that a month from now, next year, I'll look back and it won't be that bad. I'll move on, I'll go on, I'll do as best I can, but no one's going to care that I had these downturns. Maybe some biographer could, but most people are going to say, "Oh, that poem that Dan wrote about a butterfly, that short story that Schneider wrote, that ability to get in and explain why, for example, Marcel Proust's Remembrance of Things Past is not a particularly, is not as good as many people say." That helped me understand something, and very few people are willing to go to that effort because it takes a sublimation of the self, and most people are unable to do that. And so, yeah, I think that's all my years in the arts. That's what it's taught me, that too many people can't do that, but I do remember the people that can do that, and that makes that 1 out of 100 person or 1 out of 500 people makes it worth it.